Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at the MAS-36. Now, a lot of people look at the French army in World War II equipped with these brand new, hot off the production line MAS-36 bolt-action rifles, and wonder why on earth did the French spend all of this time developing a new bolt-action rifle? Didn't they realize that bolt-actions are obsolete by the late 1930s? Well, the answer is yes. And the reason that the French army had this is because this was actually one part of a three-part plan. And it's the only part that really worked very well, unfortunately. So in the 1920s, in the aftermath of World War I, the French military realized that virtually all of its small arms were obsolete. And so they instituted a pretty ambitious program to create a whole new set of small arms for the French military. The first one they did was a light machine gun, which became the Châtellerault model of 1924/29. And then when it came to infantry rifles, they actually had a three-part program. Part one was they wanted to convert whatever they could to the new 7.5 rimless cartridge. Part two was they were going to develop a semi-automatic rifle for frontline combat troops, because they absolutely recognized that semi-automatic rifles were far superior to bolt actions in combat. The French had used the RSC 1917 fairly extensively in combat. The Germans recognized this too. The Germans just weren't in a position to spend the money to develop a new semi-auto rifle as quickly as the French were able to. So anyway, the plan was all the frontline troops were going to have a semi-auto rifle by the time there was another war. By 1927, though, that development program is taking longer than people had anticipated. The conversion program isn't working quite as well as people had anticipated, and so they instituted a third part of this plan, and that was to develop a brand new bolt-action rifle in the new 7.5 by 54 millimeter, or at that time 7.5 by 58 millimeter, rimless cartridge. And the idea was, by having a new bolt-action rifle, that can be quick and easy and fairly cheap to manufacture, and it can be issued out to auxiliary troops, second-line troops, artillery crews, engineers, drivers, logistics guys, everyone who needs a rifle but isn't really likely to be seeing a lot of hot combat. So in that way, now the semi-auto rifles, they don't need quite as many, and they can focus them specifically to the front, and they don't have to worry about trying to re-equip everyone at the rear with a semi-auto or a converted old Berthier or Lebel, because they'll be able to give them this bolt-action rifle. And then eventually this will become the reserve rifle if there ever is a war and they have to mobilize all the reserves. Then all the reserves get these things, and you don't have to spend a ton of money stocking away millions of semi-auto rifles. So that is the purpose of the MAS-36. Went into development in 1927, and it was finally approved in 1936, predictably. That sounds like a long time frame. That's actually not that long of a period to develop a brand new rifle. So if we look closely at the MAS-36, it has a lot of very well thought out elements to it. Remember that this is supposed to be a backup rifle, so it needs to be really rugged, really durable, and functional and simple. It needs to be something easy to train troops with. It needs to be problem-free, but it doesn't have to be really fancy. And so what we get is this design. It is bolt action, has a 5-round magazine loaded with basically Mauser-type stripper clips. Interestingly, the French decided to make their stripper clips out of aluminum, which is, I don't know if it's better or worse, but it's an interesting choice that most people didn't make. Has sights that are interestingly completely not adjustable by the user except for range elevation. I'll tell you about the sights when we take a closer look at the rifle, because the way they did the sight zeroing is, it's again, an interesting French solution to this problem. The rifle in total, at least in its 1936 pattern, had only 65 parts, like including everything, wood pins, screws, springs, only 65. It's really a very simple rifle. It's durable, it's reliable, has a number of elements to it that you'll see having come off of things like the Berthier. For example, it has a very easy to detach floor plate, so that where, for example, on the Berthier, if you had a partial clip and you wanted to eject it, you could do that easily. Same thing on the MAS-36, you just pop the floor plate out, empty the magazine, because this rifle also has no manual safety. The French manual of arms was that you carry the rifle with a loaded magazine and an empty chamber. And when it was time to do shooting, which in the early days had been volley fire under order of an officer, well, then you would cycle the bolt, load around, and proceed to shoot. With the MAS 36, well, you know what? It's a second line rifle, and they decided it didn't really need a manual safety. That would add complexity, add parts, add expense, add manufacturing time, and they just didn't need it. You'll also notice we still have stacking rods, very much like they had on the Berthier rifles. So production, the rifle was approved in 1936. Production didn't really get going until the fall of 1937. Just took some time to set up manufacturing tooling and jigs and quality control jigs. And so fall of 1937 production gets going, and it takes them about 2 years to manufacture the first block of 100,000 of these rifles. Like most French rifles, the serial numbers on these guns are a letter prefix and then a 5-digit serial number. So in this case, the F block, Saint-Étienne manufactured all of these, and Saint-Étienne's serial number ranges started with F, but the F block of the MAS 36 appears to have been pre-production. There's only a small number of existing reported F serial number guns. It seems like once they had everything really ready to start, they started with G series guns. So until about, they were manufacturing serial number G guns until about the fall of 1939. And of course, at that point, I think a lot of people kind of went, mon Dieu, we need more rifles. And the second 100,000 rifle block took a lot less time. They put those out in about 6 months instead of 2 years. And ultimately, by the time the Germans invaded France in 1940, they had about 205,000 of these rifles available, probably most of them with units, but of course this was a rifle doesn't immediately appear in the hands of a soldier the moment it's completed. There is this procedure of, rifles are built, and then they're inspected, and they're proofed, and then they're ready to ship, and then they have to be transported to a unit somewhere, and then issued out. Troops have to be trained on the new rifles, this sort of thing. So, just because they had this total number of rifles produced doesn't necessarily mean they were all in troops' hands. And this was the most modern rifle available to the French infantry when the Germans invaded. They had, like I said, about 200,000 of these. And they had 60 or 80,000 of the converted M34 Berthier rifles as well. And then after that, it was back to Berthier carbines and 8mm Lebel. The semi-auto rifle program had almost finished. They had the MAS 1940 was in trials when the Germans invaded, but not quite finished. So they wouldn't have any of that for the beginning part of World War II. The Saint-Étienne arsenal was not in occupied France. It was in the unoccupied Vichy zone. And so while production shut down during the war, the Germans didn't actually physically occupy the factory. And so pretty much the moment that American troops liberated Saint-Étienne in 1944, production started right back up. And literally they picked up where they'd left off, which was actually the K and L serial number blocks. There's some weird detail that we won't get into in this video on serial numbers at that point. But basically they picked production back up in 1944, and they would continue to manufacture these rifles until 1957. Now, by 1949, they had an adopted new self-loading rifle, the MAS 49. However, as I mentioned earlier, the idea was that they would be simultaneously issuing both a semi-auto and a bolt action. So combat troops got the semi-auto, rear echelon troops got the bolt action. And that's why they continued to manufacture the MAS 36 well after they had the semi-auto rifles in production. They would produce these, like I said, until 57. At that point, they had enough of them produced to fully equip the reserve in case of a mobilization, and so the rifles went into storage and the production ended. There would be a couple other versions of these guns made. We'll touch on those in separate videos. But in total, the MAS 36, like you see it here, they manufactured about 1.1 million of. So, with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the specific features that make the MAS 36 unique. As I've said, this is really a quite elegantly simple rifle. You'll notice the bolt handle has this distinctive forward bend to it. The purpose of that was actually to bring the bolt handle directly in line with the trigger to make it a little bit faster to operate. Whether that works out in practice or not, I guess kind of depends on your shooting style. But It is a cock-on open action, and interestingly, it has locking lugs here at the back of the bolt. One of the French takeaways from World War I was that the locking lug recesses here in the front of the receiver on most bolt-action rifles were pretty easy to get fouled with dirt and mud, and that would cause the rifle to stop working. And they figured that having the locking lug recesses in the back would keep them a little bit more protected, and I think there's a lot of validity to that. Can't say I've actually tested one of these yet, but at some point I'm sure we will do that. At any rate, locking lugs are in the back. That allegedly, or is typically understood to have a negative effect on accuracy, but these guns were accurate enough. They weren't meant to be sniper rifles. They just had to meet basic service accuracy standards. So we can remove the bolt by pulling the trigger and just pulling the bolt out. One of the other French takeaways from World War I was that you really wanted a rifle that could be disassembled without use of any tools. The Lebel and the Berthier both required a screwdriver to remove the bolt, and that's a giant pain in the butt, and they wanted to get away from that. So they successfully did with the MOS-36. If you want to empty the magazine, you have this push button right here. Push that in, and the floor plate comes out, and then everything drops nice and easily out of the magazine. At the front here, we have a stacking swivel. We also have a bayonet that is integral to the rifle. So it's stored in this tube underneath the barrel, and it's just a simple cruciform spike. It's basically the same style of bayonet that the Lebel had. Now, by 1936, the idea of bayonet combat against enemy cavalry on horses, not so much a thing. However, the bayonet here remained a viable tool for things like guarding prisoners, where you might want to poke someone if you didn't actually have to shoot them. You could use it for probing for mines or booby traps. There were other uses for a spike bayonet. And what's nice about the MOS-36 is that it makes this thing very unobtrusive and easy to carry. In order to use it, you just flip it around, and it locks in that same tube, just like that, and just store it away when you don't need it. So one of the nice elements about the MOS-36 is its sights. This gun may not have been designed as a sharpshooting rifle, but they did get the right sort of sights on it. That rear aperture is quick and easy to use. They couple that with a large front post, as had been done, adopted in about 1916, and it makes for a very quick and easy rifle to acquire targets with and fire with. Now, you'll notice that this is not adjustable in any way, save for the elevation slider here, which I have all the way out at the furthest extent of its travel. However, they did have a way to zero the rifles, and it's kind of clever. What they did is actually have 25 different versions of this rear sight and leaf. What you would do to zero a rifle is you'd put it in a clamp, in a rifle rest. You'd fire a 5-round group, and you'd fire on a target that was divided into a 5x5 grid. And you'd end up with a group of 5 shots somewhere on that target. Well, the target is divided into 25 separate boxes, one right in the center, and then you had boxes that were centered 4 and 8 centimeters left, right, up, and down. So what you would then do is pick which box your group of shots went into, and you would then take the rear sight that was set for that box. Those rear sights would have the aperture drilled slightly to the left or right or up or down or any combination thereof. So an armorer could clamp a rifle down, fire 5 rounds, put in the correct leaf, and then the rifle's zeroed. Once you're in the field, they really didn't want the troops to be messing around with the sights. You weren't supposed to adjust this for temporary wind conditions or anything like that. And if you ever had, of course, the ammunition is all standard military issue ammunition, so you don't have to worry about the sights being different for different loadings. And if there was ever a problem with the rifle, it goes back to the armorer and they re-zero it. This attitude of simplicity and not wanting the troops to be messing with things shows up in other places as well. For example, on the barrel band here, this is the tensioning screw that holds this barrel band in place. It has a hinge here on the side. And that tensioning screw doesn't have a normal slot, it just has 2 holes in it. And that's because these rifles were basically tuned by the armorers to shoot nicely, and if you started messing with taking the handguards on and off, you would mess up the bedding of the rifle and it would have to be re-zeroed. So to prevent troops from doing that, if you weren't allowed to take it apart, they put it together with a screw that wasn't easily accessible to the troops. You'll note that the trigger group here, however, can be removed. This screw is a normal slotted screw, so this is something you could remove for normal maintenance or cleaning. But the nose cap here, nope, that's another one that's off limits to the infantry. Now, I should show you how the bolt disassembles, because that's also pretty cool. This is actually a later bolt. And on the back, we have two letters, a D and an M. D is for démontage, which is French for disassembly, and M is predictably for montage, for assembly. So when this is put together, there's a little line here. The assembly line lines up with that notch on the bolt body, so you know it's in the assembled position. In order to disassemble it, we're going to push this cap in and rotate it, like so. And then we are going to get the bolt plug, the striker spring, and then the firing pin or striker itself, and the bolt body. And short of taking out the extractor, that's the whole bolt disassembled right there. No tools, no fuss, 4 parts. It's impossible to put it back together wrong. They really wanted to simplify the bolts compared to the old Lebel and Berthier system, and they did it really well. This is somewhat analogous, somewhat similar to the Japanese Arisaka bolts, and it's an excellent bolt system. There's really nothing bad to say about it. Now let's take a look at markings. There actually aren't that many on these guns, and pretty much everything you're going to need is here on the side of the receiver, the left side. This is going to have the arsenal of production, in this case Manufacture d'Armes de Saint-Étienne, and Saint-Étienne produced all of the MAS 36s, so you won't ever see a different marking there. The model designation, model 1936, and then the serial number. It's important to note that this is a letter prefix, and until they got to like FH, the French used a cursive script letter. So this is G. This is in fact one of the, basically the first complete block of rifles manufactured. G and H blocks were manufactured in their entirety before the armistice in 1940. They then went on to, well, they skipped I because it looks too much like 1. They went to J. The J block, actually J, K, and L were all started before the armistice. They only made about a quarter of the J block and then stopped. K block and L block were both, it was up to about 33,000 K and up to about 3,500 L were manufactured before the armistice. And then after the liberation of Saint-Étienne in 1944, they picked up and they finished off K and L and then went on to the M and N blocks. They skipped O and then did Q, or P and Q. And then because of the way the French arsenal system worked, Saint-Étienne was only issued the letters F through Q. So after they finished Q, they went back and started over at the beginning with FG and then FH, and then they started FJ, and they got to about 19,000 rifles in FJ, and that's when they had enough total and shut down production. You will also find that serial number on the bottom of the magazine, the bottom of the trigger guard, the bottom of the handguard, here on the side of the bayonet, although some of the early bayonets will have a 2-digit, just the last 2 digits on the front surface, and on the stock. And as you will recognize if you've been watching some of my earlier series on French rifles, there's also going to be a roundel on the right side of the stock that is the official acceptance stamp for military service. And that is going to tell you exactly when this rifle was completed and accepted. This one, you'll see on top there it says May, and on the bottom, 1939. So that's when this rifle was accepted into military service. One other marking I want to point out, because it is here on this pre-war gun, is this LK5 stamped on the back of the buttstock. And nobody has any actual documentation of exactly what this means, but the best guess out there right now is that it is actually a German re-arsenal mark, that this was used by the Germans, probably a Luftwaffe group. The Germans did extensively use captured MAS 36s, as well as captured Berthier M34 conversions. They used them to equip troops in occupied France. troops on the Atlantic Wall, troops who needed guns but probably weren't going to be getting into a shootout with anybody. So the non-standard caliber was an acceptable trade-off for that sort of use. Anyway, you'll find LK5 on some MAS 36s and also some other French rifles like those Berthier M34s. Now there are basically two models of the MAS 36. In reality, these changes were done one at a time, not as a single package, and they happened over the course, well, some of them between 1937 and 1940, and some of these changes were made in the mid-40s when they resumed production. But for the sake of this video, because it is pretty much 98% of what you'd ever need to know, we're going to focus on the two main varieties, and that would be a pre-war and a post-war gun. So this guy is a pre-war, this is a 1939 gun, and this one is a post-war gun. It's an M serial block, so it was manufactured in the late 40s, and then this one has actually been factory refurbished. This one has not been. Now, the most distinctive change between the pre-war and post-war guns is the nose cap here. You'll notice that on the pre-war gun, we have a pair of vertical sight protectors, like that, one on either side of the front sight, and this whole nose cap piece is this pretty finely made milled component. Now, those vertical sight protectors aren't maybe the greatest design. It's fairly easy to, in a rush, accidentally try and use one of these ears as the front sight. And for that reason, and for production speed reasons, after the war, they changed to this stamped design, which has a hood that completely encircles the front post. So you're not going to accidentally try and use that hood in your rear sight aperture. You just can't. And this guy, you can kind of see some of the differences here. This is a much quicker and easier piece to manufacture. So on this one, the block that the stacking rod goes into is an integral machined part, and the stacking rod is, I believe, threaded in there. On the post-war ones, the stacking rod was made as a separate piece. It's pinned on in the back and then brazed in the front. So simplification, cheaper and easier to make. And honestly, it's actually technically an improvement in usability. The sling attachments would also change. So this is our pre-war gun, and it has a sling bar on the left side and another sling bar on the bottom of the handguard, or the bottom of the stock. It has actually a hinge. You can't really even see it. There's a hinge right there, and to take this thing off, you take out this screw and then the whole thing opens up, and well, this gives you two different ways to carry the rifle. You can use this to carry it across your back, or you can put the sling here, and it's a little more conducive for carrying over the shoulder. However, that was complicated, and not many people really took advantage of it, and after the war ended, they'd had enough of that nonsense, and switched to this style instead. This is just a stamped band. The top surface here is actually threaded. There is a screw that holds tension on the thing, and so to take this apart, you just loosen the screw and then spread this out and pull it off over the handguard. And on that screw, there is also this ring. This is very reminiscent of the sling attachment from the Berthier rifles in World War I. And that did the job just fine. So they changed to that after the war. I should point out, though, on both pre- and post-war guns, the rear attachment was always the same. It's just this sling bar with an inlet cut into the stock. One other substantial difference was in the sights. This is our pre-war gun, and you can see it has notches cut in the top of the leaf. This is the post-war gun, and they moved the notches to the side of the rear sight base. On this guy, what you do to adjust it is actually push the rear sight leaf down. Once it's down, it's spring-loaded. Once it's down, you can move this slider to whatever position you want, and then the notches here lock into the elevation slider. And I don't know exactly why they changed this. There might have been an issue with recoil bumping this, but for whatever reason, after the war, they switched. They put the notches on the side of the rear sight block and added this little push button on the slider. So you push the button in, move the slider to wherever you want it, and then that locks it in place. And there were a couple other minor changes. The floor plate was a milled component on the pre-war guns. It went to a stamped component on the post-war. There is a little bar inside the trigger mechanism. On the post-war guns, there's actually a little tab coming off the back of the trigger to help prevent dirt from getting in this hole at the back of the trigger guard. And oh, and then one last one that actually does have an impact on shooting, and that is the follower. On the pre-war guns, the follower had a little bevel right there. So even when it's empty, you can still close the bolt. On the post-war guns, they changed that. They put a solid flat surface at the back of the follower, so once the magazine's empty, the bolt locks open and notifies you that it is, in fact, empty. Despite the adoption of a semi-auto rifle in the 1940s, the French would absolutely use these substantially in combat operations after World War II. These were used extensively in Indochina as well as Algeria, and the French supplied them as material aid to a lot of other small countries, mostly African countries, but also in Southeast Asia. And so these rifles would continue to serve, in fact, they still show up today in combat zones, especially in North Africa. You'll occasionally find Vietnam bring-back ones here in the United States. The legacy on those is the French had them and either supplied them to friendly Vietnamese or Cambodian or Laotian or other Indo-Chinese troops, or they were captured from the French by, say, the Viet Cong, and then whoever got them, the American troops that came later in Vietnam would eventually capture those from North Vietnamese allied fighters, and some of those came back to the United States as war trophies. So in a later video, I'll actually show you one of those. But we also have a lot of these in the US that were eventually surplused by the French from those reserve stocks. This one here is actually an example of that. And that's why it's in such outstanding condition, is when it went into basically into a reserve depot, the rifles were refurbished, refinished, made basically like factory new again in case they would ever be needed, and they weren't needed, and so they were sold to the US in that condition. So you will occasionally even find them in the US still in their original refurbishment factory wrapping paper, which is pretty cool. While the MAS 36 may not have all of the wartime changes and that cool element, historical element that a gun like the Berthier does, they're really cool. I think they're really fairly underappreciated. Americans don't typically pay much attention to the Battle of France or the various French colonial wars in Africa and Indochina. And this is a cool piece of history from those parts of the world. So if you enjoy seeing this sort of thing on the internet, please do consider checking out my Patreon page. It's the support from folks there. It makes it possible for me to do videos every day like this. And if you are really interested in French firearms, you can check out this cool t-shirt over on the Forgotten Weapons merchandise store. Due to massive demand, we have brought it back. It was originally a limited edition in black like this. It is now available as a standard item with a gray background instead. So if you think that the French Army is a pretty cool and interesting group, well, get yourself one of the shirts and show that to other people. Thanks for watching.